Alright, settle in because this one's a bit of a long haul. But trust me, it's worth it. I've been piecing this story together for a while now, and every time I think I've got it figured out, something else twists it all up again. It's a story about a place called Whisperwind, and what happens when you listen too closely to the silence. It starts, like a lot of these things do, with a place. Whisperwind. Sounds peaceful, right? Like some kind of new age retreat or a place you'd go for a nice, quiet vacation. That's what they wanted you to think. The truth was way different. Whisperwind was a town, tucked away so deep in the Appalachian Mountains that most maps didn't even bother with it. You ever been that far out? Where the blacktop gives way to gravel, and then the gravel turns to dirt, and even the dirt road seems to be swallowed by the trees. That was Whisperwind. We're talking roads that were more suggestion than asphalt, switchbacks that climbed so steep they felt like they were going straight up, and a kind of isolation that pressed down on you like a physical weight. You couldn't just stumble on Whisperwind. You had to want to find it or be led there. The nearest town of any size was about 50 miles away, a place called Havenwood, which wasn't much bigger, but at least had a gas station, a couple of diners, and a sheriff's office that wasn't just a guy with a sidearm and a pickup truck. The people of Whisperwind rarely went to Havenwood, and the people of Havenwood didn't much care to go to Whisperwind. There were stories. Whispers, you might say. Stories about strange lights in the hills, about rituals in the woods, about a silence that wasn't natural. The town itself wasn't much to look at. A main street that barely deserved the name, more like a wide spot in the road, really, a few scattered houses clinging to the hillsides, their windows dark and watchful, and this old, abandoned church right in the center of it all. Most of the buildings were made of dark, weathered wood, and they looked like they'd been there for centuries, slowly sinking back into the earth. The only relatively new structure was the general store, a two-story building with a faded sign that read Murphy's Mercantile, but even that looked like it was fighting a losing battle against the encroaching forest. The church was the key, you see. It was the heart of Whisperwind, and it was rotten to the core. It wasn't just old. It was ancient, built from stones that looked like they'd been dragged down from the mountains themselves. The architecture was unsettling. A weird mix of styles, like different people had added onto it over the centuries, each with their own twisted vision. There were carvings on the stones, shapes that didn't quite look like anything, but that made you feel uneasy when you looked at them. The roof sagged, the stained glass windows were cracked and dark, and the whole place smelled of damp earth and decay. Now, I wasn't there when it all started. I came in later after everything had already gone to hell. But I've talked to people who were there, people who saw it happen. And from what they tell me, it began with the silence. See, Whisperwind was always quiet. Rural, you know. No highway noise, no city bustle, just the sounds of nature. But this was different. This was a silence that went beyond the absence of sound. It was like the world itself had gone mute. The wind didn't rustle the leaves. The birds didn't sing. Even the creek that ran through the town, Whisper Creek, usually a babbling brook, seemed to flow without a sound. Its waters became still and dark, reflecting the brooding sky like a sheet of black glass. Old Man Hemlock, who lived in a cabin even further up the mountain, he was the first to notice it. He'd been living there for 80 years, and he said he'd never heard anything like it. He came down to the town worried, talking about the death silence, and how it was a bad omen. Most people just chuckled at him, figured he was getting senile. But a few felt a prickle of unease. To give you a better picture, Hemlock wasn't your typical mountain hermit. He was a wiry old guy with eyes that seemed to see right through you, and a voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. He knew the mountains like the back of his hand, knew every trail, every hollow, every hidden spring. He'd lived alone for so long that he'd almost become a part of the landscape himself. The people of Whisperwind, while finding him eccentric, respected his knowledge and his connection to the natural world. So when he spoke of a death silence, it wasn't something they could easily dismiss. His cabin was a sight to behold, a ramshackle structure built from scavenged wood and stone, clinging to the side of a cliff like a bird's nest. It was filled with strange artifacts, animal skulls, oddly shaped rocks, feathers, and herbs hanging from the rafters. The air inside always smelled of wood smoke and something else, something earthy and ancient. He had a library of sorts, consisting of tattered books on obscure subjects, folklore, herbalism, forgotten religions. It was in these books that he'd learned about the old ways, the hidden powers of the mountains, and the things that dwelled in the shadows. When Hemlock came to town that day, he was carrying a gnarled walking stick made of blackthorn wood, its surface carved with intricate symbols. He walked slowly, deliberately, his brow furrowed with worry. He went straight to Murphy's Mercantile, the general store that served as the town's unofficial gathering place. Inside, the usual assortment of townsfolk were going about their business. Mary Murphy, the store owner, a stout woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, was serving a customer. A couple of old-timers were sitting by the pot-bellied stove, whittling and swapping stories. A few children were playing in a corner, their laughter echoing through the dusty store. Hemlock stood in the doorway for a moment, his presence silencing the room. All eyes turned to him, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. He rarely came to town, and when he did, it usually meant something important. "Folks," he said, his voice raspy and low, "I've come to warn you. There's a sickness in the mountains. A silence that ain't natural. The woods are holding their breath, and that's never a good sign." Mary Murphy stopped what she was doing and looked at him, her face etched with concern. "What do you mean, Jedediah? What kind of sickness?" "A death silence," Hemlock repeated, his eyes fixed on some distant point. "The wind don't blow, the birds don't sing, the creek is still as glass. And there's a feeling, a wrongness in the air. Like something's waiting." The old-timers by the stove stopped whittling and exchanged uneasy glances. The children stopped playing and huddled together, their eyes wide with fear. Even the dogs outside seemed to sense the unease, their playful barking replaced by low growls. Hemlock went on to describe the feeling of dread that had settled over the mountains, the sense of being watched by something unseen. He spoke of ancient legends, of spirits and entities that dwelled in the hidden places of the earth, of a time when the veil between worlds was thin. Most people just chuckled at him, figured he was getting senile. But a few felt a prickle of unease. Sarah, the baker's wife, was one of them. She was a sensitive woman with a kind heart and a deep connection to the natural world. She'd always felt a sense of peace and tranquility in the mountains, but lately she'd been feeling disturbed. A sense of unease that she couldn't quite explain. Hemlock's words resonated with her, stirring a deep-seated fear that she'd been trying to ignore. At first, some people liked it, thought it was peaceful. A break from the noise of the world. A chance to actually hear your own thoughts, some said. But then the dreams started. The dreams were the first sign that the silence wasn't just an absence of sound, but an active presence. They began subtly, with a sense of unease that lingered after waking. People would describe feeling restless, their sleep disturbed by vague, unsettling images. But as the silence deepened, so did the intensity of the dreams. Everyone in Whisperwind started having the same dream. Or, at least, dreams that shared the same presence. They described it as a vastness, a darkness, but not an empty one. It was full of something. They couldn't see it, not clearly, but they could feel it. A sense of immense age, of power, and of an intelligence so far beyond human understanding that it was terrifying. Imagine the oldest, deepest part of the ocean, where no sunlight reaches, and then imagine that darkness was alive. That's what they felt. The dreams varied in their specifics. Some people saw swirling galaxies, endless and cold. Others saw towering structures of black stone that seemed to defy gravity and logic. Some heard music, but not music as we know it, more like a vibration that resonated deep within their bones. But the feeling was always the same, awe and dread. A sense of insignificance so profound it made their blood run cold. These weren't like normal dreams. They were vivid, visceral experiences that left a lasting impression on the dreamer. People would wake up sweating, their hearts pounding, with a sense of dread that lingered throughout the day. The dreams felt realer than reality. They blurred the line between the waking world and the subconscious, leaving people disoriented and confused. The content of the dreams was often symbolic, hinting at a deeper meaning that the subconscious mind was struggling to comprehend. The swirling galaxies represented the vastness of the cosmos, the insignificance of humanity in the face of such immensity. The towering structures of black stone symbolized an ancient, alien power, a force that defied human understanding. The unsettling music was a language of the soul, a vibration that resonated with the deepest fears and desires of the human psyche. Sarah, the baker's wife, had a recurring dream that terrified her. She found herself standing on the edge of a vast abyss, a bottomless chasm of darkness that stretched out before her. As she gazed into the abyss, she could feel a presence, a sense of being watched by something immense and unknowable. Then she would hear her name whispered from the darkness, a faint, haunting sound that seemed to call to her, promising her something she couldn't quite grasp. The dream left her with a feeling of intense longing and dread, a sense that she was being drawn towards something both terrifying and irresistible. The dreams had a profound effect on the people of Whisperwind. They became withdrawn, preoccupied, their minds consumed by the visions that haunted their sleep. They lost interest in their daily lives, their work, their relationships. The vibrant community that had once thrived in Whisperwind began to unravel, replaced by a sense of isolation and dread. And then the whispers began. Not in the waking world, not at first. The whispers came in the dreams. Faint at first, like the rustling of dry leaves, or the hiss of wind through a narrow crack, but growing louder, more insistent, night after night. They weren't words, not anything anyone could understand. It was more like a language of the soul. But they carried meaning. A sense of dread, of longing, of a hunger that was ancient and vast. A hunger that whispered promises of power and threats of annihilation. The whispers were insidious, preying on the deepest fears and desires of the subconscious mind. They spoke of forbidden knowledge, of ancient secrets, of powers beyond human comprehension. They promised to unlock the mysteries of the universe, to grant immortality, to fulfill the most fervent desires. But they also hinted at a terrible price, a sacrifice that would have to be made in exchange for such gifts. As the whispers grew louder, they began to invade the waking world. People would hear them in the rustling of leaves, in the creaking of the old houses, in the silence of the night. The whispers became a constant presence, a haunting reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of reality. One woman, Sarah, the baker's wife, she said she heard her name in the whispers. Not clearly but implied. A sense that something was calling to her, specifically. She started having trouble sleeping, terrified of what she might hear next. Sarah's experience was not unique. Many people in Whisperwind reported hearing their names in the whispers, a sense that they were being singled out, chosen for some unknown purpose. This created a sense of paranoia and unease, as people began to suspect that their neighbors, their friends, even their own families, were also hearing the whispers, and perhaps even heeding their call. The whispers had a corrupting influence, twisting the thoughts and desires of the people of Whisperwind. They amplified negative emotions, fueling resentment, jealousy, and fear. They eroded trust and compassion, turning neighbors against each other. The once close-knit community became fragmented, divided by suspicion and paranoia. People started to change. They became withdrawn, quiet even for Whisperwind. They stopped going outside, staying in their houses, listening to the whispers in their sleep. It was like they were being drawn into themselves, becoming more and more isolated from the world around them. They stopped tending their gardens, stopped visiting each other, stopped going to Murphy's Mercantile for supplies. Their eyes, people who saw them said their eyes looked wrong. Hollowed out, like something was looking out from behind them. Like they were puppets and something else was pulling the strings. The change in the people of Whisperwind was gradual but unmistakable. They became pale and gaunt, their bodies weakened by lack of sleep and nourishment. Their movements became slow and deliberate, as if they were moving through water. Their voices, once full of life and laughter, became monotone and lifeless. Their eyes were the most disturbing change. They lost their sparkle, their warmth, their humanity. They became dull and vacant, like the eyes of a doll. It was as if the person behind the eyes had been replaced by something else, something cold and alien. They stopped interacting with each other, preferring the company of the whispers to human contact. They neglected their responsibilities, their homes, their families. The town fell into disrepair, mirroring the decay of its inhabitants. The town preacher, a man named Elder Amos, he tried to fight it. He was the only one who seemed to understand that something evil was happening. He was a fire and brimstone kind of preacher, even before all this. But now his sermons became frantic, desperate. He preached about the devil, about ancient evils, about the need to repent. He spoke of signs and portents, of the end times, of a cosmic battle between good and evil. He even started carrying a Bible with him everywhere he went, clutching it like a lifeline. But nobody listened. They just stared at him with those empty eyes. And some of them would even smile, a slow, unsettling smile that had no joy in it. Elder Amos was a tall, gaunt man with a stern face and a booming voice. He had always been a figure of authority in Whisperwind, respected for his piety and his unwavering faith. But as the whispers took hold of the town, his influence waned. People dismissed him as a fanatic, his words falling on deaf ears. His sermons became increasingly apocalyptic, filled with vivid descriptions of hellfire and damnation. He spoke of the ancient serpent, the devourer of souls, the entity that dwelled in the abyss. He warned of the false promises of the whispers, the price of listening to their call. But his pleas were met with indifference or worse, hostility. Some of the townsfolk would heckle him, their voices filled with a strange, mocking tone. Others would simply stare at him with those empty eyes, their faces devoid of emotion. Then the disappearances started. One by one people began to vanish. Not with a struggle, not with any kind of commotion. They would just be gone. Vanished from their homes, from the streets, leaving behind no trace. Their beds would be empty, their breakfasts untouched on the table, their tools left lying in the yard. It was like they'd been plucked out of reality. The disappearances added another layer of horror to the already unsettling atmosphere of Whisperwind. They created a sense of constant dread as people wondered who would be next. The fear of the unknown was often more terrifying than the known, and the lack of any explanation for the disappearances fueled the growing paranoia and suspicion in the town. The first to go was little Timmy, the Murphy's boy. He was playing in the woods behind the store and he just wasn't there anymore. His mother searched for him for days, calling his name until her voice was hoarse, but there was no sign of him. The others didn't seem to care. They just kept listening to the whispers. Timmy's disappearance was particularly disturbing because he was a child, innocent and vulnerable. It shattered any remaining sense of normalcy in Whisperwind, highlighting the unnatural and malevolent nature of what was happening. His mother's grief was inconsolable, but the other townspeople seemed strangely detached, their minds seemingly focused on something else. As more people disappeared, the remaining inhabitants of Whisperwind became increasingly isolated and withdrawn. They barricaded themselves in their homes, afraid to venture outside. The town, once a vibrant community, became a ghost town, its streets deserted, its houses dark and silent. Then the screaming started. It wasn't constant, but it was pervasive. It would come at night, echoing through the silent town, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. It was the sound of someone being taken. And the silence that followed each scream was worse than the scream itself. It was the silence of the void. It was a silence that seemed to press in on you, to fill your lungs and your mind, suffocating you with its emptiness. The screaming was a sound that no one who heard it would ever forget. It was a primal sound, a cry of anguish that transcended language and pierced the very soul. It spoke of unimaginable pain, of a violation so profound it shattered the victim's sense of self. The silence that followed was equally disturbing. It was a silence that seemed to amplify the horror of the screams, a silence that hinted at the finality of death and the unknown terrors that lay beyond. It was a silence that made the listener feel utterly alone, abandoned by God and man. The screaming, it was the worst sound I've ever heard even now. It wasn't just the sound of pain. It was the sound of loss. The sound of someone being torn away from everything they knew, everything they loved, everything that made them human. And it was always followed by that silence. A silence so complete it made your ears ring. That's about the time the outside world started to notice that something was wrong. A few calls from worried relatives, unanswered. A mailman who went in and never came out. Old Man Hemlock, he'd managed to get a message out to his nephew in Havenwood, a rambling, terrified message about the silence and the dreams and the whispers, before he too disappeared. Eventually, the state police sent in a couple of guys to check it out. They didn't last long. The details are sketchy, but from what I've heard, they found the town changed. The houses were all dark, the streets deserted. The only signs of life were the occasional figure glimpsed in a window, staring out with those empty eyes. And then, they heard the whispers. And the screaming. The whispers were faint at first, a low, murmuring hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But as they went deeper into the town, they grew louder, more insistent, until they were a cacophony of voices, a chorus of madness that threatened to overwhelm their minds. The screaming came later, a single piercing shriek that echoed through the silence, followed by that awful, crushing quiet. They ran, but they didn't run fast enough. One of them, a young rookie named Davis, made it back to his car, radioed for help, his voice trembling so badly his words were almost unintelligible. He managed to get out a few words, town, empty, voices, screaming, and then, the line went dead. They found his car later, a mile or so outside of Whisperwind, headlights still on, the engine still running. Davis was gone. The other cop, an older, more experienced guy named Malone, he wasn't found until the next day. Or rather, parts of him were scattered along the old logging trail that led out of town. His body armor was ripped open, his gun was twisted into a pretzel, and there were markings. The same kind of markings that we would later find on other things. That's when they called in the National Guard. And that's where I come in. I was in the Guard. Not your weekend warrior type. Let's just say I'd seen things. Things that most people wouldn't believe. Things that went bump in the night, things that defied explanation, things that made you question your sanity. But nothing could have prepared me for Whisperwind. We went in force. Armored vehicles, Humvees with mounted machine guns, full combat gear, the whole 9 yards. We had a company of infantry, a squad of engineers, and a couple of medics. We figured it was some kind of cult thing, maybe? Some backwoods militia that had gone off the deep end. We were ready for a fight. We were ready for anything, except what we found. What we found wasn't a fight. It was a slaughter. It was a massacre, a desecration, an abomination. The town was wrong. The silence was still there, thicker than ever. It was like wading through molasses, a heavy, oppressive stillness that muffled every sound, even the crunch of our own boots on the gravel. The houses were all dark and empty. But it wasn't the emptiness of abandonment. It was the emptiness of consumption. As if something had hollowed the place out, leaving behind only empty shells. There was no sign of a struggle. No overturned furniture, no broken windows, no bloodstains. Just emptiness. An emptiness that was somehow violated, tainted. And then we started finding the remains. I won't go into detail. I can't. Even now, years later, the memory of it makes my stomach churn. But let's just say that whatever had happened in Whisperwind, it wasn't human. And it wasn't natural. There were bodies, or parts of them, arranged in ways that defied any kind of logic. Limbs twisted and contorted, organs exposed, flesh rearranged. It was like a grotesque parody of anatomy, a sick joke played by a mad god. There were symbols carved into the flesh that made your skin crawl. They weren't any symbols I recognized, not from any religion or mythology I'd ever seen. They were alien. Angular, jagged, unsettling. They seemed to vibrate with a dark energy, a sense of wrongness that made you want to look away but you couldn't. You were drawn to them, repulsed and fascinated at the same time. And there was a residue. A kind of presence that clung to everything, a feeling of wrongness that made you want to vomit. It was a smell too, a cloying, sickly sweet odor that reminded me of rot, but not organic rot. More like the decay of something inorganic. Something cosmic. We found the church. That's where it was the worst. The doors were open like it was inviting us in, mocking us. And inside was the source of the whispers. It was hard to describe. It was a thing but not a thing in any way we understand. It was a mass of flesh and bone and something else, something that shimmered and pulsed with an unholy light. It was connected to the church itself, woven into the walls, the floor, the very foundations of the building. It was like the church was its body and it was its heart. The best way I can describe it is, imagine a tumor. But a tumor the size of a room. And not made of human cells but of something else. Something that shifted and changed, that writhed and pulsed, that seemed to be alive in a way that defied biology. It was covered in those same symbols, those angular alien markings, and it glowed with an inner light that was cold and malevolent. And it was speaking. Not with a voice, not in words, but with thoughts, feelings, images. It was broadcasting. And we could hear it. Not with our ears but with our minds. It was a telepathic assault, a psychic violation that tore into our consciousness and shredded it. It was the whispers. And what it was saying, it was driving us insane. It was the void. The endless, empty darkness between the stars. But it wasn't empty. It was full of life. A life so alien, so ancient, so powerful that it made humanity look like insects. It was a life that hungered. A life that craved. A life that saw us as food. As resources. As playthings. The whispers were its call. Its invitation. Its promise. And its threat. It was promising us power, knowledge, transcendence. But it was also threatening us with annihilation, with oblivion, with a fate worse than death. It was trying to seduce us, to corrupt us, to break us. Some of the men went mad. They started screaming, clawing at their eyes, trying to rip the thoughts out of their heads. They babbled incoherently, their faces twisted in rictus grins of terror. Others, they just went limp, their eyes glazing over, becoming vessels. Their bodies still moved, but they weren't in control anymore. They were puppets. I don't know how I survived. I saw things, I heard things that no human being should ever have to experience. I felt the weight of eons, the cold indifference of the cosmos, the gnawing hunger of the void. But somehow I held on. Maybe it was the training. Maybe it was just stubbornness. A refusal to let go of my own sanity, my own humanity. But I survived. Barely. We tried to fight it. We threw everything we had at it. Guns, grenades, even a flamethrower. But it was like trying to kill a shadow. The bullets passed through it, the grenades exploded harmlessly, the flames licked at it but didn't seem to burn. It didn't even seem to notice us. It just kept whispering. Then one of the men, a young kid barely out of basic, he did something insane. His name was Miller. He was scared, shaking like a leaf, but he had this look in his eyes, a kind of desperate courage. He charged the thing, screaming, with a crucifix in his hand. It was an old, tarnished crucifix that he'd pulled from his dog tags. I don't know if he was religious or if he just snapped. But he charged. And it worked. Not in a Hollywood way. There was no burst of light, no dramatic confrontation. But the thing, it recoiled. It flinched. Its light flickered, its pulsing slowed. And for a moment the whispers stopped. It was enough. It was like a dam had broken. The psychic pressure that had been crushing us suddenly lifted and we could breathe again. Think again. We started pulling back, dragging the insane and the catatonic with us. It was chaos. Men were screaming, crying, vomiting. Some were completely catatonic, their eyes blank and unseeing. We got out of that church, out of that town as fast as we could. We didn't look back. We called it an airstrike. We leveled Whisperwind. We turned it into a crater. I watched it burn. I watched the flames lick at the sky and I could still hear the whispers, faint but there. Even over the roar of the fire. It was like the void itself was screaming, a sound that echoed not in my ears but in my soul. We thought we'd contained it. We thought we'd stopped it. We were wrong. It wasn't gone. It was just sleeping. Waiting. Gathering its strength. And it's still whispering. I can hear it sometimes in the silence. A faint, distant call, like the echo of a nightmare. It's not as strong as it was in Whisperwind, but it's there. A constant reminder. And I know deep down that it's not over. It's not going to be over until it's all over. The void is patient. The void is hungry. And the void is coming.